Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the Roosevelt House and the CUNY Institute for Education Policy. I'm Peter Meyer, Program Director of the Institute, where I have the pleasure not only of working on events such as this one, but directing and contributing to our news briefs and the policy analysis that appears on our website. We currently anticipate two more Next Mayor's series. One on the 6th of August, next Tuesday, with Anthony Weiner, and the second on the 13th with Sal Albanese. So we will send out announcements for those when we get closer. In a moment, you will hear from David Steiner, Dean of the Hunter School of Education and former Commissioner of Education of New York State. As Commissioner, David Steiner played a leading role in securing the state's $700 million Race to the Top award, radically restructuring teacher preparation and accountability and telling the truth about our state assessments. On returning to academia after his commissionership, the CUNY Board of Trustees voted to make Dean Steiner the creator and first director of this institute, which we formally inaugurated this May. The Institute is New York City's first university-based policy analysis and research institute devoted solely to understanding the challenges of PK through 20 education. Strictly non-aligned, we aim to make it the go-to location for policy debate, analysis, and research. We are doubly fortunate to be building the Institute in this splendid building of great historical importance. A few years ago, Cy Flegel, a veteran New York City educator, told me about a conversation he had with Mayor Michael Bloomberg early in his first term, when the mayor was lobbying the state legislature to grant him control over the city's schools. Up to then, they had been run by 32 different community boards of education. "You want to be in charge of the schools?" Flegel asked Bloomberg. "Yes," said the mayor. "You're crazy," Flegel replied. Bill De Blasio certainly has experience to offer insight into the meaning of that exchange, and we are delighted that Mr. De Blasio is here this morning to inaugurate our Next Mayor series. Mr. De Blasio started his political career as an aide to Mayor David Dinkins, served on one of those local school district community boards that have since been abolished, and was a member of New York City's council for 3 terms, beginning in 2000. And for the last 3.5 years, he has been the city's public advocate, the second highest public office in the city, just after mayor. With that, I want to get right to what promises to be a wonderful discussion about one of the most important topics of this year's mayoral election, New York City schools' future. Thank you again for coming. I will now turn the discussion over to David Steiner.
Good morning, everybody. Delighted to be here and to see you again. I have the great privilege of directing this institute, and just as a reminder, we are strictly non-aligned. We are completely devoted to pragmatic, useful, effective thinking and policy to raise the performance of the students of our great city and, of course, of our country as well. We had a rousing launch in which 3 very veteran educators had at it, and we certainly have a tradition we hope to preserve that we talk about the facts as clearly as we can. The format today, and the honor of starting the series, goes to Bill, and thank you so much for giving us that opportunity, is to enable our candidate to say a few words about his vision for education in New York City. I'm giving them up to 10 minutes. If they don't need it, all the better. And then we will have a back and forth for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to you, the audience, for your questions. And the only request I make of that is that this is about education. There are, of course, 100 other deeply pressing topics on which Bill has been deeply pressed on many other occasions. But today is really about education. That's what this institute is devoted to. So, Bill, over to you for your thoughts on the future of education.
Thank you so much. May I
Please.
Liberate this microphone?
Absolutely.
I see we're supposed to keep it close, and I have a height issue with all microphones. So. Thank you so much. First of all, I have to thank everyone. This is the issue that we need to talk about for the future of our city, morally, in terms of every element of the future of our city, public safety, social fabric, the future of our economy. It all comes back to the quality of our public education system. So there's no more fundamental debate to have than this. I'm thrilled to be here with Dr. Steiner. He doesn't know it, but I'm a great fan of his because I think in public life, we're called to tell the truth and to do things that are difficult and to undo past patterns that may have been unfair and destructive. And I think Dr. Steiner's courage in addressing the test score dynamics of this state, which had long been swept under the rug, and the test score recalibration was a very, very difficult thing to do, but it was something fundamentally necessary. So I want to thank him for his leadership and his bravery. On this question, I always bring the topic of education both back to my own experience and to what I think it means for addressing the crucial challenges of our times. And I think at this moment, you know, the problem of inequality is the issue gripping New York City. So just a moment on each of those points. My perspective on public education starts as a product of public education myself, as a parent of 2 New York City public school children. If the people choose me, I will be, to the best of our research, I will be the first mayor in the history of this city to serve while having a child in public school, which I think is important because I think it is time that our leaders relate directly to our public schools and to the children they're supposed to be serving and the parents they're supposed to be serving, even more true under mayoral control. But as I say, I think, not only do I think education is the core issue in terms of determining our future, and I would argue, and I have a true expert to my right, and I bet he will affirm this, more than at any point in human history, your level of education determines your economic destiny. I think that was much less true even 30 or 40 years ago. So we're in a brave new world here where our obligation is to ensure that every child is well educated. We've said that, I'm sure, for generations, but didn't act on it, perhaps in part because there was a different economic reality. There was real economic possibility available to those who did not have as good an education. That's just much less true now. And if we do not want to have a society riven by inequality, we have to address the challenge of education more fundamentally. This city right now, in my opinion, you may have heard me say, I think we are living a tale of 2 cities, and I say that across a set of issues, whether it is the greatest income inequality since 1929, or persistent educational disparities, or healthcare disparities, or policing disparities. I think this is not appropriate or healthy for the future of our city, for the future of our social fabric. I don't think it actually represents the values of New Yorkers either. We are amongst the most progressive and inclusive people you're going to find anywhere. We actually believe this place is for everyone. And when it comes to education, we have a lot more to do if we actually want this place to be for everyone because of those new demands placed on all of us in the new economy. So 4 simple points I want to raise, and I'll keep it very brief. If we're going to fundamentally change our school system, and I like to say wherever I go on the question of schools, you know, I like to raise the definition of insanity. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. We need to do some things very differently if we don't want the current reality to continue. The current reality is a large number of young people who either don't graduate or graduate barely with the skills they need or graduate with some of the skills they need and go to a CUNY college and needing an immense amount of remediation. Whatever way you look at it, whatever piece of that puzzle you look at, it's not anywhere near where we need to be, and that suggests fundamentally changing the approach. And just one crucial parenthetical, I mentioned the personal perspective. I bring as a public school parent. I did not mention, I think the introduction noted that I've been a community school board member. I also spent 8 years on the City Council Education Committee and have focused on education in a lot of my work as advocate. So I've had the privilege of spending a lot of time in schools, not just talking to many hundreds or thousands of parents, but also teachers and principals and professionals and folks at the various networks. So I've really tried to get some perspective. And the 4 things I want to talk about are based on what's been for me a 12-year journey of discovery, trying to make sense of these challenges. Well, first, I want to talk about the community school model. I think it's gotten a lot of attention, rightfully. I don't want to say it's a panacea. I'm not a believer in panaceas. What is the plural for panaceas? You're very erudite. Is it panaceas? Excellent. Thank you, doctor. It's very reassuring. Stadia. Okay, I got that one right. I'm not a believer that any one thing will fix our schools. I think anyone who spends time around education immediately is gripped by how complicated the subject matter is and how many different pieces have to be put in play to make a change. But the community school model is powerful. Yes, I have been to the mountaintop. I've been to Cincinnati. I have basked in the golden light of Cincinnati. I like to remind us all, before Cincinnati, the model was developed by the Children's Aid Society right here. And I've been to their facility, too, in East Harlem, where a lot of that work was done. Here's what I love about the community school model. It recognizes life as it is. It looks at the role of family in education. It looks at the role of health in education. It actually treats the community as a partner in education, whether that means volunteerism by individuals or whether that means the business community more deeply involved. I think we have created, sadly, a dynamic where the school is an island within a community as opposed to something fully integrated into a community, and that cuts both ways. I think the community benefits from a greater understanding of the schools and how central they are to the future. The schools benefit from a much greater level of community involvement. So schools I visited in Cincinnati, the level of participation and volunteerism by, in many cases, seniors, for example, who came in, read to kids and tutored them, companies that got involved, that made a fundamental difference. The fact that physical and healthcare options were available in the schools and paid for by the same funding streams that were existing already with Medicaid that would have paid for them elsewhere, I think it fundamentally maximizes the chance of a child getting on the right track and staying on the right track. We can go into more of that later. My goal is to have 100 community schools by the end of my first term, and I think because it is so fundamentally based on existing resources that that's a viable goal. Now, secondly, I think we need, everyone knows how important principals are, everyone knows how important leadership is in determining a school. Many would argue, I think is a fair point, single greatest determinant in school success would be the quality of the principal. But I think we need to change our approach to developing that core of principals and assistant principals. For a school to be great, you need a great leader. To have a great leader in New York City, in my opinion, you need to maximize opportunities for those who have come up in the educational system of this city to get to leadership roles. I have a critique of some of the approach of the Leadership Academy under Bloomberg. I think one of our pressing challenges is to recruit great teachers and keep them, and then see many of them turn into great assistant principals and great principals. It is hard to do that if the opportunities are limited because many times people are brought in from outside the system or who have had less experience brought into the principal role. I want there to be a clear career ladder where those who are talented know they have a real opportunity to come into this system, stay in this system, develop their talent. And I think there's a separate issue I'm sure we can get into about how to support principals. I think the networks have brought a lot, but I think more is needed, and I have some ideas about how to maximize the value of networks.
Summarize the other two.
Yes, and the last ones are very quick. It's good. You're good. You're a good supervisor. Finally, I think to get at the core issue of inequality, we have to address what the school system is missing. We are missing a focus on early child education. We're missing a focus on after school. I don't think anyone in this room doubts the value of early child education. Central fact, 50,000 kids every year in New York City public schools are at pre-K age and yet do not get full day pre-K. In terms of after school, you can see on this lovely chart, We have lost 30,000 after-school seats in the last 5 years. My plan is simple. A tax on the wealthiest New Yorkers. It is something we have the power to do. It is a modest tax, but one that would give us $530 million a year with which to create full-day universal pre-K, an after-school guarantee to middle school students. And I think that would be transcendent, and I think if we don't do it, I will finish on this point. If we don't do it, we should not expect to achieve the fundamental changes that we need to make this school system actually work for everyone.
Great. Thank you, Bill. The fact of the matter is that if you look at large cities across the United States in the last 10 years, none of them have closed the achievement gap, and none of them have really moved the ball enormously on college and career readiness. However, under the Bloomberg-Klein administration, high school graduation rates are up, smaller high school performance is up, enrollment rate is up, college readiness rate is up, college readiness for African American Hispanics has been doubled. The dropout rate is down. On just about every measure, there has been major progress, and yet you have said, and I quote, "The lights are out, no one is listening," in Tweed, and you've called for fundamental change from the Bloomberg administration. How do I put those two things together?
I'll give you an easy way to put them together. First of all, the first quote is about what I think is fundamentally true. One of the great negatives of mayoral control as Bloomberg implemented, and by the way, mayoral control of education is an idea and a good idea. It can be implemented many ways. The particularly narrow, uninclusive, unconsultative way in which the Bloomberg administration approached is not the only way to do it. So when I said lights are out, I am saying Tweed is a single building that is essentially impossible to access if you are an average parent, making decisions about 1.1 million school children, and that to me means at minimum there's no feedback loop, and there's very little ability for people to register their concerns and needs. On the question of fundamental change, I think some of the achievements of the Bloomberg years, I applaud them and I would build upon them. I don't think there's a contradiction, but I would say this much. If we're moving the wrong direction on after school, if we're moving in the wrong direction on early childhood education, or better put, if all around the world there is a greater investment being made in early childhood education in New York City that is just not true, and we have tools to use that would allow us to invest in early childhood education, I would say I'm glad and I'm gratified. I think for all of us, we appreciate that progress. We need to build upon it. If we stopped right here, we would still be failing a huge number of children. And in a pattern of inequality, and I think you're literally one of the great experts on this point, the patterns of inequality would continue unabated. If we want to get at inequality, early child education is one of the most fundamental tools we have because of children's ability to learn at those ages.
You are obviously on record as being very discouraging, if I could use that word, of further expansion of charter schools. This strikes me as bizarre, frankly, as someone who's...
How do you really feel?
As someone who's devoted to reducing the achievement gap. The very well-known and I think largely unimpeachable Credo study that found across the country some rather mixed results for charter schools, actually rather poor in some cases, was very clear that in New York City, particularly the charter schools under the management organizations, but in general, have done an extraordinary job, including in mathematics, for example, an average of 6 months greater learning per year than matched students in other schools. We have 50,000 families on waiting lists for charter schools. Are they all misguided? Why do you want to keep what's clearly a very effective model for many of our least privileged students from more of them?
I think, well, obviously you are presenting the question in a certain light. Let me recast. You're leading the witness. So I think what you said at the beginning is accurate, that we've seen mixed results. There are some very good charter schools, and I'm glad we have them. And there are some that have not done well, and I think part of the challenge until the very end of the Bloomberg years was acknowledging the fact that they are mortal. Some work well, some don't. But I think my central concern is this. The equality point, first of all, in terms of who is the composition of the student body of any school, We know, it's a fact, that some charter schools have done an extraordinary job of being inclusive of all types of students, mirroring the realities of the districts they're in, focused on English language learners and special ed kids. In fact, there are charters that went out of their way to get even more English language learners and special ed kids. A lot of people would argue that was the original motivation of the charter movement, was to reach those in greatest needs and need. And we also know there are charters that have gone out of their way to underrepresent some challenging populations. So in traditional public schools, we don't have that choice. We are there for everyone, and in traditional public schools, we are carrying 95% of the burden right now, meaning 95% of our children in our public school system go to traditional public schools. That number is fundamentally not going to change under any model, in my opinion, and our central task for the future of our city is to address the challenges of the traditional public schools. So one part of my view is the charter debate has taken us away from what we have to do to get to the core of the changes we need to make. When we're not talking about after school, we're not talking about early childhood education and a number of other things, we are obscuring the core questions. I think you're right to say there are parents who would like to get their child to a charter school.
Lots of them.
Lots of them. But here's my logic. They would like that because their local school still is not, their local district school is still not doing a good enough job. You offered the sunny statistics of the Bloomberg years. I would say the downside, and it's not an indictment of Bloomberg per se, it's an indictment of decades, is if we're still not getting it right at the district school level, that is or has to be our central focus, not to replace with another option that I think is questionable, and I just explained why. I don't think charters are a panacea. I think the core work of our times is to get the foundations of education right, and that begins with early childhood. If we haven't done early childhood, why are we even having the discussion?
Well, because those schools, the best of them, as you say, have beaten those odds. I mean, let me make the point a little more pointedly. If you were to say that charter schools, in order to be supported by your administration, had to match the special ed, ELL ratios of the schools around them. But if they did, and of course they are held accountable for their results, if they did, then given the success of the schools in New York City, and that's after all what we're talking about, you would support them. But I don't think you've said that. You seem to be saying they work, the regular schools don't work, therefore we should take our eye off the model that works.
No, wait. I'd said overtly, I have a transcript, that many don't work and they are not a panacea, and others do work. Many are unrepresentative, many are representative. I think it is a complicated movement like every other part of human endeavor. But what I'm saying is I believe in the cap we have now. I believe within that cap we can do better, because some schools have not worked. They can be replaced by those that do. Some schools are unrepresentative. They can be replaced by those that are representative. There's plenty to do within that 5% to do a better job. Let's do that first, is one point of this equation. But separately, I think it's honestly part of the kind of public debate we have. Declare yourself. I'm declaring myself. Sure. My focus is not on creating an alternative to the traditional public school system, but getting the traditional public school system right. And I think the charter movement, and you're more of an expert than I, but I think the charter movement in part originated as, one, a response to those being underserved and an effort to innovate how to serve them better, and two, with the notion of sort of healthy competition to spur on the traditional public schools to do better. I think that still gets back to the core point that traditional public schools are the core of the system, and I believe there are tools we have not even begun yet to employ to make them better.
Okay, so you're not going to embrace the New Orleans model of simply charterizing the public school district.
That would be accurate.
Let's talk about the lovely good ideas that almost no one I know in the reform community, including myself for whatever that's worth, could possibly be against. Intelligent investment in early childhood, further opportunities for students to study AP courses and tests, arts education, which you spoke of very recently. Obviously all costs money, and community schools aren't free either. Critics have suggested that your tax proposal to pay for this is dream world. It simply isn't going to happen, can't happen politically.
Someone explain why.
Well, I think the onus is on you to suggest how how this could be realistic. What is the political world you see where taxes are going to be raised to pay for this?
Well, Doctor, now you're on my playing field.
Play away.
I think what we're talking about here, first, this would be a tax on those who make $500,000 or more. Again, it is modest. The tax rate of the city of New York would go from 3.9% to 4.3% for that income bracket. That is 0.1% less than the level it was early in the Bloomberg administration at the proposal of one Michael Bloomberg. So we are very much in charted territory here. Taxes that have been appropriate and successful are those that are delineated for very specific purposes. Mine is for two purposes only: full day guaranteed pre-K and after school just for the middle school level, because that's where we thought it could have the biggest effect, and that's what we thought we could afford. It's for 5 years. When I announced it last October at the Association for Better New York, I said it will have to then be, the resources will have to be found by other savings in government. The political question is simple. If we're saying to the people of this city, we need these resources so people can have, so the city can have better education for its children, but for those families affected, so we can fundamentally improve their situation, I think you'll have a very, very strong constituency there that believes this is the right thing to do. On the question of whether those making $500,000 or more can help us a little more, for example, a family that makes $1 million would pay $2,000 more a year, I think there'll be a broad consensus that that is fair, is not punitive, it's a fair request. And then on the question of Albany, Albany, almost without exception, has agreed when a local executive and a local legislature have called for the right to self-tax. Albany, almost without exception, has agreed. Then the question would I be able to get a majority of the city council to buy into the notion of taxing those who make over $500,000 for early childhood and after school? I think that is no question about that. I mean, I literally do not have a question at all about the politics of that. I'm certain we would have that majority. I think in terms of implementation, there are capital dollar dynamics that are absolutely correct. We would have to, in some cases, create pre-K centers to be able to accommodate this. Some schools could handle it as they are existing, but others would need the creation of local pre-K centers. I think that's a good thing for us to do. It will take, as you know about our capital budget here in the city, is a series of choices. I'm someone who said openly I would put more focus on education within capital dollars. Guess what? Something else would not happen as a result. But I would argue that getting education right has such ramification for the future of the city that that is the right investment to make. So no, I think this is quite attainable and realistic, and I think there'll be tremendous support for it.
One of the things you and I would share if you became mayor would be an experience of spending quite a number of hours with Michael Mulgrew. One of the situations that you would be talking about is the absence of a teacher contract. And one of the first issues I imagine Michael would raise with you would be the 4 years without a raise. You recently remarked quite rightly that this wasn't the only contract you would be facing in terms of negotiation. But how would you want to go into that negotiation, and what would your vision be for a successful outcome?
Well, as I like to say, I am unburdened by the support of municipal labor unions. So I know Mr. Mulgrew very well, and he's someone I work well with, but he obviously made another choice, so I will approach the situation. Lots of people like to say, well, look at Mayor Bloomberg had the great advantage of independence. He didn't need anyone's money. He didn't need anyone's endorsement. I have my own independence. We need contracts for all of our public employees. It is unprecedented and unconscionable that we have none of our employees under contract right now. It's not productive. Those contracts are staggered for a reason. They're supposed to be handled all in their due time to avoid exactly that which we have now, which is now, in effect, a man-made fiscal crisis we're about to face for the next few years. What I'd say to Michael Mulgrew or any of the other labor leaders is, put on the table anything you want, and I'll put on the table our reality, and I'll tell you some of the things I need, and I would like it to be a transcendent moment. I would like it to be a grand bargain moment where we make some real progress on some of the things that the city needs, because Lord knows, everyone is in a moment of deep need, but there's clear fiscal limitations. There will be for years. Hopefully we can use this as a creative moment. I've said, unlike some of my opponents, I don't put any preconditions on the conversation because I don't think that's how you get to a positive outcome. I think both sides have to be able to put anything on the table. And when you're debating labor contracts through the media, bad things happen. You have to ultimately win over not only the leaders on the other side of the table and get to some common ground, you have to win over their members in the end, and that's best done with careful, thoughtful negotiation. So I think it is going to be exceedingly challenging, but I think the fundamental notion that we have to get to a contract in year one is accurate. I think some recognition of the years where there was no increase, some way of addressing that has to be found. I think there are some options, but fundamentally, we only have the money we have. And that's the one thing that's, I think everyone in this room knows, you have to balance your budget by June 30th of each year or you go under state receivership. That's how it works around here. We can't print money, so we will have to deal within that reality.
One question that is very much on the mind of teachers in the city, of course, and some of us aren't innocent of putting that in front of them, and that is the teacher evaluation against principal observation, teacher tests. I'm not sure you've said yet publicly where you stand on tying teacher evaluation to student academic performance in terms of the review of their employment and their professional development. Could you say a few words about your thoughts on that?
I think what I have said is I believe in a mix of measures. I want to just remind you, my critique of standardized testing is sort of generational. I came up in the time when standardized testing, particularly in the form of the SATs, was being questioned all over the country for being culturally biased and questionable in terms of how it treated all the people who took the test. But I come from a second filter on this, which is I just am distrustful of any single numerical measure as the determinant of very, very important decisions. I found the grading of schools arbitrary, and I think we have ample evidence that the grading of schools kept changing and the goal line kept changing, and that was problematic for parents trying to make sense of things. I don't like, for example, that our specialized schools are, that entrance to our specialized schools, which are, the jewels in the crown, is determined by a single test. So I look at this first from a fundamental discomfort with the over-reliance on any kind of test. And then second, I would say, I believe the only way you get at the truth is by layering multiple measures. Obviously, testing is going to play a role in that, but classroom observation and portfolios and all of the measures, which is, as you know better than anyone, time-consuming, costly in the scheme of things, but I would argue much more accurate. And if one of the issues of our time is not just the way this debate has played out, and I think you'd agree with me, much of the debate on evaluation has been about the bad apples, quote unquote. It has been about the perceived ineffective teachers, and there are some for sure, but if you were to just read New York Post stories, you would think it's a lot of ineffective teachers, and you would not know we have a teacher retention problem with effective teachers. And I would argue that part of why I believe in a combined set of measures for evaluation is I want to get to the core work of our times, which is keeping talent for the long term.
The good news is we currently in state law have a mixed measure. Let me open it up to the audience and perhaps ask members of the press if they would hold their questions just for a few minutes until we invite others. And again, a reminder that questions on education, please. And maybe stand up and say your name.
Wait a minute, we're talking about education? Didn't realize.
All right. Bill, you're a public school parent, as am I, and you haven't really addressed the voice of the parents in the process. When mayoral control came in, they tried to do some things to keep a parental voice in the policy, not just in involvement in the schools. And they included such things as the school leadership teams and the community education councils, which I would guess a lot of people in this room have never heard of because they've been quite ineffective in my experience. And I served on both the SLT in my school and the Citywide Council on High Schools. So my question is, what would you do about the parental voice? Is there something to be done with those structures? Would you scrap them entirely? Is there something else you would do to give parents a real voice in the policy?
It's fundamental to the success of our schools, not just a parental voice, but parental involvement, and you won't have involvement at the level we need without the voice. You won't have involvement in the day-to-day education of their children if we don't start to improve a lot of other things, including how we do parent-teacher conferences and many other things. But on the central question of voice, I see community education councils as needing an updating in which they play more of a role like a community board does on planning and land use issues, where they are more central to the debate, for example, on co-locations and closures, and where there is this, as we see with community boards. Community boards do not get to veto anything, but they loom very large in the process because they affect how those who are elected think about the decisions. I want to mirror that with community education councils. I want to have a central board where there's set terms for the members. I still believe in a mayoral majority, but I want some freedom for those members to speak and think and critique. So I would like to see an updating of mayoral control that actually encourages debate and encourages parental voice. And I certainly don't think, part of why I believe in a moratorium on closures and on co-locations is that until you give parents a meaningful voice in things that affect the building in which their own child goes to school, you know, we aren't going to help we won't get the decisions right, but we also won't encourage parents to play a bigger role. I don't think you should have a co-location or a closure, for example, without parents well in advance being able to offer their concerns, their critique, their alternatives, and the current approach under Bloomberg never allowed the timeline for that. So I would have a moratorium until that could be achieved.
Mike is coming.
As a retired president of the same Community Education Council,
You survived it.
I survived it. I would like to follow up Kim's question with a little bit more specificity. You know, in District 15, for example, which is your old stomping ground and my recent old stomping ground, that we were very involved in co-location issues, and that in many instances, in some instances we supported them, in some instances we strongly opposed them, with, by the way, a significant timeline under the legislation put forward for the hearings. There was significant time allowed. I'm wondering why you have never supported the Wright bill, Keith Wright's bill, which would give community education councils veto power, at least over co-locations. I would tend to agree that closings is probably politically impractical for a CEC to deal with. I've yet to know a CEC that would actually support a closing. But I do know CECs, mine in particular, and others that have support, and even like in District 1, which is considered sort of the ultra-left district, which has supported co-locations in certain instances. Why, in other words, why would you not support CECs having veto rights?
Because I believe it can be done fairly within a context. Look, I want a more progressive and inclusive vision of mayoral control, but I still want mayoral control. That's just a reality. And I think the way I would look at it and the way I would direct my chancellor to look at it is, if there's a substantial amount of concern being raised at the CEC level, that has to be weighed, and that might cause a meaningful change in the plan, or a reworking of the plan, or a decision not to attempt the plan. That's what we don't have now. Right now, every plan that comes out of the Tweed building goes to what is effectively the kangaroo court dynamic of the PEP, where the vote's already been determined, and there really isn't a check and balance. I would argue that if the mayor and the chancellor understand that we want to treat the CECs as a meaningful check and balance, you don't have to give them veto power for them to have a powerful voice in the process. That's what I'd like to try. I think that would be the most effective, least politicized way of going about it. If that didn't work, I'd be open to other options. But in my office, we offered a series of reforms to the DOE of how we could better engage parents in co-locations. They were consistently ignored. But I think if you look at the reforms we offered, they're public reports from the last few years, there is a way to do this in the current structure that could actually lean much more heavily to the voices of parents.
Okay. Other questions? Go ahead. We're going to get you a mic. There you go.
I have a two-part question having to do with education mandate. I know 1 to 6 ed in the city schools, and I went to your website, and thank you for your support. But how would you promote medically accurate, comprehensive, non-biased sex ed in our schools? Excuse me. And second, the state education department requires all schools under its jurisdiction to provide a program, to provide a program of health, physical education, and recreation. Physical education positively impacts health and recreation, as well as the academic achievement. How would you cause compliance with this mandate?
I appreciate that question very much. I'm someone who, despite the slings and arrows, supported Mayor Bloomberg on the soda ban. And soda ban is the wrong phrase implicitly. It's not a ban. It's a narrow limitation for fast food restaurants and all, but I'm leading into your question with this point. I believe we're obviously losing the battle against youth obesity. And I supported that measure because I thought it was actually in solidarity with parents to start acting on a culture and economy around us that seems to just keep facilitating obesity. But I think within the public sector, we need to do something very different in terms of phys ed. It is, as you know, exceedingly uneven around our school system, in part because of space limitations. But as Dr. Steiner will admit, in New York City, we have an interesting approach to the law. State laws, we were just talking about this in terms of the mandates around arts education. State law is applied flexibly to the point of, optionally in a lot of our public schools. And that's not really allowable in the final analysis. And when it comes to phys ed, I'm very struck by, for example, my son Dante at Brooklyn Tech. They're very focused on phys ed. They have the facilities. It has a huge impact on his ability to be educated and to be fit. And then I know plenty of other schools where the facilities aren't there. I think the answer is one, relentlessly through our capital budget, looking for where we can make improvements. Another school in my former district, the former John Jay High School, had a play yard available, but it was being used for parking. We had to work for years to liberate that parking and turn it into a play yard. That's made a very positive impact for kids. Play streets. In another example from my former district, we created in a former armory a recreation center, huge recreation center that surrounding schools were able to use. There's a lot of ways to deal with the space limitations, but we must deal with them both because of the law and because there's no way to combat obesity and improve learning without doing it. So it's very much about capital budget. On sex ed and health ed, I don't know quite how to answer the question except to say I believe in a very comprehensive and pervasive approach, and I think it's fundamentally necessary for the health of our kids, and I don't have my head in the sand on any of these issues. I think the public schools are exactly the place where we can help get out a lot of information that young people need.
Go ahead.
Larry Moss. How would, in addition to the UFT endorsement, which you've alluded to, Bill Thompson has his own record as president of the Board of Education and has made education central to his campaign. So how would you appraise his record and the value of his experience as president of the board, and how would you contrast his proposals for improving the schools with yours?
Well, I respect his record, but I think we can't continue on the same path we're on, and I think this sort of mirrors a lot of the rest of the debate we're having right now in this city. I am looking for more fundamental change. And I don't think we can address the fundamental problems of our schools without the new resources necessary for early childhood education and after school. I don't think we are going to have those resources if we don't tax the wealthiest New Yorkers. Obviously, Bill Thompson is opposed to taxes on the wealthiest New Yorkers and hasn't presented a plan to address these core needs. So I think he is knowledgeable, I think he's concerned, but I don't think he's proposed the kind of solutions I have.
Question for the mic's coming. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Peter Goodman. The recent state data shows that the number of Afro-American black males who graduate college and career ready is in the low single digits. That's across all the state, and probably in the city it's even lower. And while we've had parents from District 15 and the middle class districts in the city speak about parent involvement and everything else, but if you go into East New York and Brownsville and Rockaway and the really poor communities of color in the city, very little has changed. Schools have very low performance, suspension rates are enormous. The kids see very little hope. And looking around this audience, clearly there's probably no one here who represents those communities. How can you bring hope to the parts of the city who have seen mayor after mayor make promises and nothing has really changed?
Well, first, I right now represent those communities as public advocate, and I've spent a lot of time in those communities. And I think parents are yearning for deeper involvement. And I say this as a parent myself. I mean, I think one of the core points is if you can't talk to decision makers and your voice does not result in any changes in policy, you don't get as involved. I think if parents start to see, and this is part of what I think we have to do to bring back some meaningful presence from district superintendents, for example, if parents can talk to decision makers, if parents have some say in what happens to the school building their child goes to, I think they will get more deeply involved. Again, I think we need to change the approach to parent-teacher conferences, et cetera. So I think parents of all backgrounds, of all economic levels can be more deeply involved and are ready to be if they think it's meaningful. On the question of how do you address the inequalities, I don't think any one thing is the silver bullet. I've established that fact. I do think nothing is more powerful than early childhood education, and this is one piece of the puzzle I'm presenting. If we get to full-day pre-K guaranteed, that is a beginning. We'll have to do a lot more. I'd love to see us then reach over time to the 3-year-old level more comprehensively. I think we have to do a fundamental reworking of our schools in terms of what I mentioned earlier, teacher recruitment and retention. That I think if there's a belief among the best and the brightest that they can come into the system, stay in the system, have real promotional opportunity, I think that's going to affect teaching in every kind of neighborhood. So lots of pieces to the answer and the solution, but the gateway to equity, to helping students in East New York and Brownsville and many other less advantaged neighborhoods, the first step is early childhood education.
Let me quickly follow up, because you raised a question about the career path of teachers, which we agree is so important. Are you actually in favor of some kind of merit pay so that after 30 years, the teacher who has constantly brought her students to very high levels isn't compensated in exactly the same way as one who hasn't?
I'm in favor of something separate but related, which is additional pay for those who work in particularly needed areas, subject areas, additional pay for those who become, of course, master teachers, lead teachers, those who work in schools that are particularly needy. I think there's a set of rewards that we can and should use to achieve strategic goals. I do not agree with broad-based merit pay.
Hello, I'm Stephen Sodders. I'm a parent and a former high school history teacher. I'm not here, not in New York, in DC. In any event, I wanted you to, excuse me, I wanted you to address the Finnish model. The Finns achieve broad-based educational equality, and they have world-beating students on all the tests, and they do it by hiring teachers only from the top 25% of the graduating classes from competitive universities, whereas in the United States, many of our teachers come from lower ends of their college classes and not necessarily from competitive colleges. Would you be willing to try any part of the Finnish model, hiring only the most talented people from college, paying them very well, and then giving them almost complete autonomy in the classroom outside of testing? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have heard the legend of Finland. I know, of course, that it's a unionized workforce and it's been exceedingly effective, so it's healthy to kind of take us away from some of the culture debates to look at the fact that it's not whether, again, charter or traditional public school, unionized or ununionized, there's a lot of other things going on here. So I think the Finnish model is important. I don't know it well enough to give you a satisfying answer. I think we've done a lot better at paying teachers. Obviously, I think there's some areas where we could still do more strategically. Do we want the most educated people? Of course, and we want, I think, to achieve that and to achieve retention, it is about improving the opportunities for teachers to teach creatively and to have that career ladder. But I don't know the model enough to say whether I'd put those particular restrictions or goals on the process. I'm happy to study it because there's obviously been success, but I can only start with some basic assumptions from it.
one last question.
Anita Ween, if there were universal pre-K education in New York, how would you staff that? And would it be with the existing teachers or bringing new people in with different skills?
Well, I think, let me differentiate the pre-K piece of my plan from the after-school piece of my plan. You know, I think right now our pre-K approach has strengths, and so I think we would be building upon that. A lot of people have said to me, how would you make sure it's as good as it could be? Well, again, I'd say first, I think we're doing some very good things in pre-K right now in this city, so I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel, but it would be as with everything. This is something I actually think even Dr. Steiner would agree with. I think we would be constantly experimenting. We're in some place called Roosevelt House. There was no greater experiment in the history of government than the New Deal. I always like to say, I'm diverting for a quick second, I always like to say, people, please read Adam Cohen's book, Nothing to Fear, about the central figures of the New Deal. They were, in the most noble sense of the words, they were making it up as they went along. There was no roadmap. And we all have to be willing to experiment. So I would say, I think we're doing a good job with pre-K right now. I would hire existing teachers with the existing model, and then I get to work to see how we could make it better. With after school, I would use the after school corporation model, which has been very effective in this city, but which can be applied in a nonprofit. It can be applied in a community-based organization. It could be applied in a library, or it could be applied in a school building. So we have a little more flexibility there. So that's the way I would balance the two.
Well, it falls to me to thank you very, very much. I would note that you are the first in the series and have opened yourself up for this conversation, and we are very, very grateful. You began with The Tale of Two Cities, of course, a quotation from Charles Dickens, who in the same text says, this is the best of times as well as the worst of times, and perhaps that captures something of the progress that has been made, but the gaps that deeply remain. So thank you, everybody, for attending, and we look forward to having you at future events.
Thank you very much.